Okay, folks, we're going to reconvene for the third panel of the day. We're going to be, I think, switching our view a little bit from retrospective, when we were looking back at what happened with Kosovo and in Georgia, and we're going to be looking, I think, a little bit more prospectively for the last two panels. And on this panel specifically, we're going to be looking at current challenges in the EU and in prospective states that could accede to the EU in Eastern Europe. And so what we'll first have is more, I think, of a theoretical and general overview from our first speaker, and then we will have on the second and third speaker more specific focus on some of the specific cases in Europe prospectively. Our first presenter on this panel is Jason Sorens. Jason is an assistant professor of political science at the University at Buffalo of SUNY, which back when I lived in New York, we used to call the State University of New York. He works on secession, ethnic politics and conflict, fiscal federalism, and public policy in federal systems. And his recently published book is entitled Secessionism: Identity, Interest, and Strategy. And that just came out recently last year. So without any further ado, Jason Sorens.
Thanks, Alan. So I'm taking here a more comparative politics approach to the question of secessionism and secession, looking less at the international community and the conditions under which recognition should be granted, the sorts of third-party interventions that might be justified, and looking more at the domestic context, the institutional and economic origins of secessionism. Here are the key questions I'm going to address. What is secessionism in the European context? What are the sources of secessionism? How have central governments responded, and with what consequences? And here I'm particularly interested in looking at the political and economic uncertainty attendant upon secessionist challenges, regional institutional development, both below and above, that is, autonomy at the sub-state level as well as European integration, and how secessionist demands respond or are affected by central government strategies. And then finally, how likely is an actual secession in Europe within the next several years? First, conceptualizing secession. I have a broad conception of secessionism. In this talk, I'm going to use secessionist to refer to any movement that supports both of these two things. First, significant political autonomy for the national group, whatever that means. At least a legislative body that's elected and has control over at least cultural and educational policies, for instance. And second, a right to self-determination for the national group. Independence, in other words, not being ruled out. So these are groups that want autonomy and don't rule out independence as a possible end of that process. Unlike regionalist movements that might want autonomy but explicitly rule out independence and say they're just interested in promoting the regional interest. Now, in defense of this rather broad understanding, so I'm not including movements that explicitly say we want an independent state, I will argue that at least within the context of high-income democracies, all secessionism is conditional. There are no unconditional secessionists who say, we want independence no matter what the central government does. Even the Scottish National Party, which is a classic case of a secessionist political party that throughout its history has favored independence for Scotland, is really a conditionally secessionist party. If we look at SNP voters, a significant minority of them don't even support independence. And of the rest, most only support independence if it can be achieved within the European Union. And they also support keeping political ties with Britain. They support keeping the monarchy, keeping things like the BBC, allowing free migration between England and Scotland, and so on. At the other end of the spectrum, Catalan Convergence and Unity, the CIU, has long been taken as a sort of moderate minority nationalist party, non-secessionist. I have always considered it, although it's a hard case, among the secessionist family, even before Artur Mas's recent move to try to establish a Catalan state, as he calls it. This party has always, although opposing independence in the short term, has always supported a right to independence for Catalonia and supported greater autonomy, especially over fiscal matters. So it fits within this broad understanding of secessionist movements, and I would argue the fact that it has easily moved to now supporting a Catalan state is evidence that there's really no hard dividing line between these movements for robust autonomy and for independence. Autonomy itself is a continuum. No state is completely independent of all political ties with the rest of the world. European Union member states have treaty obligations and indeed can see their own domestic legislation overruled by institutions at a higher level. So they're autonomous units that are not completely independent. The Isle of Man is an example, a crown dependency of the United Kingdom that has complete internal autonomy, more or less, but its defense and foreign affairs are taken care of by the United Kingdom. But it's not even governed by EU law, so in some areas, the Isle of Man actually has more autonomy than the United Kingdom. Quebec is an example of a province that you might think is like an American state, but it has the right to control immigration, which is normally thought of as a central government responsibility. In the Basque Country, the regional government collects all taxes and remits a portion of those to the central government. So the Basque Country enjoys far more fiscal autonomy than any Canadian province or American state. So we see that autonomy is really a sliding scale. Again, there are no hard lines between the different statuses along that continuum. Where does secessionism come from? I defend a more or less rationalist view of secessionism. Even if ethnic identity itself is not rational, that is, people are not strategic about their own ethnic identities and their national affiliations, whether the national or ethnic affiliation leads to demand for independence or robust autonomy does depend on group interests. So the model here, it's not just my own model, but people like Henry Hale, who's written on Eastern Europe, has this same model. The model is that cultural distinctiveness for a group plus territorial concentration leads to a conception of a nation for at least some group members. Some group members start to think of themselves as belonging to a nation. And what that means is they think of that nation as the fundamental political unit, the society for which decisions are to be made. And so group members that think of themselves this way, nationalists, then evaluate policy proposals and potential political statuses on their consequences for the welfare of the group, of the nation, right? And so when national interests demand more autonomy, then they'll support more autonomy. If national interests demand integration, then they'll support integration. So group interests then determine political status demands. So what aspects of group interests matter here? Fiscal transfers are an obvious one. If the region is a net fiscal loser to the central fisc, it pays more than it receives in expenditures, then there's an economic rationale for robust fiscal autonomy or even independence. And we see greater likelihood of secessionism and stronger secessionist movements where we see these net fiscal outflows from the region. Population, larger regions are more likely to support stronger secessionist movements because these regions are more viable as independent states. Ideological differences, regions that differ ideologically from the national median. So Scotland would be an example where the Scottish median voter is well to the left of the British median voter, and that's one reason why many Scots support independence. Support for independence grew dramatically under Margaret Thatcher and John Major's governments, because Scotland, many Scottish voters thought that they were not represented adequately at the centre. Geographic separation in ports, islands, and exclaves are more likely to support secessionist movements, as are coastal regions than landlocked regions. And the argument here is pretty straightforward. If independence were to lead to trade barriers between the seceding state and the rump state, that would hurt the economy of the seceding state, but less so if the seceding state is geographically separate and has the ability to trade easily with other countries. The Faroe Islands, for example, are a territory of Denmark, but they're in between Iceland and the Shetland Islands, so they don't really trade much with the rest of Denmark. They trade with other countries, so there's not really much risk to trade if they were to secede from Denmark. Existing autonomy does decentralization to potentially secessionist regions inhibit or provoke more secessionism? And there's no real clear answer to this question in the literature. People have taken both sides of this. My own view of it is that it's highly conditional and contextual, and that there's no general answer that we can give here about whether existing autonomy reduces support for independence or fosters it. Economic conditions, there's a little bit of weak evidence that when economic conditions are generally poor, secessionism declines. We've seen this a little bit with the financial crisis and the decline in support for independence in Scotland, for example. It's not entirely clear why this is, but it might have something to do with the fact that that voters tend to be risk averse, and anything that increases the risk of having a small state, in the sense of increases the standard deviation of possible outcomes, economic outcomes in the future, that tends to make voters prefer the status quo. Demonstration effects. Do secessionist movements in one part of the world foster secessionist movements elsewhere? This has come up in our conversation here. And largely, the research has shown that there really aren't demonstration effects across borders. So it's not as if a secession movement in Britain will foster one in Spain or vice versa. But there are demonstration effects within a country. So if a secession movement becomes stronger in, say, Catalonia, that's more likely to improve secessionist electoral performance in the Basque Country. It may even create new secession movements, and we see all this in Canada, where Quebec had a very strong independence movement, and as a result, Alberta started having its own little ripples of secessionism, and never a very strong movement, but they actually did have some political parties running candidates advocating independence for Alberta. Policy concessions to potential secessionists on their own are unlikely to work. And the reason is this commitment problem. So we say to you, central government might say to a region, no need to secede. We will implement the language policies that you want, or we will implement the fiscal policies that you want on our own. We'll pass legislation doing this, but we won't give you autonomy. That's not going to solve the issue because of a commitment problem. What happens in the future? What happens if there's another central government? They might take back those privileges. And so policy concessions do not on their own generally seem to reduce secessionism. Central government responses, decentralization, does not seem to reduce secessionism, but nevertheless, we see that secessionist regions tend to get more autonomy within Western democracies. Countries with secessionist movements decentralize faster, and when they decentralize, they give more autonomy to the secessionist regions. So if it's not working, why are they doing that? One argument here is that central governments do this for the office-holding value that they have in autonomous regions. So the Labour Party in Britain implements devolution for Scotland and Wales because they're strong in Scotland and Wales, and that will be a place where they can win elections if they're not in power at the central level. Referendums and the right to decide. And here we see a big difference between Western democracies. So Canada, Britain, and Belgium are examples of states where secession is treated as a political issue, where it's permitted. There's a legal path, potentially, to independence. And referendums have been held in Quebec. In France, Spain, and Italy, the Constitution defines the country as indissoluble. And central governments have taken a hard line and said, you may contest elections, you may promote autonomy, you may even, in a free speech sense, advocate independence. We're never going to allow you to actually achieve that. There is some global evidence here that countries that provide a legal path to independence are less likely to experience outbreaks of secessionist violence. And we see this even within the Western democracies, where Canada, Britain, and Belgium have had little secessionist violence proper, whereas France, Spain, and Italy have had more, especially France and Spain. There's political and economic uncertainty attendant upon a lack of a legal path to independence. How exactly is this going to be negotiated? Consider the case of Catalonia. What's going to happen in Catalonia? They're going to try to hold a referendum. The central government says it's illegal. What is the ultimate end game there? We don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty attached to that. By contrast, look at Britain. There's still uncertainty attached to the Scottish referendum, but there, the Scottish Premier and the British Prime Minister have agreed on a referendum question and agreed that provided these conditions are met, independence will be permitted. And that at least removes one source of political and economic uncertainty. Secession referendums have never succeeded in the West since the Faroe Islands voted in 1946 for independence and then quickly backed down from that. These referendums usually fail, again, because voters tend to be risk averse. And in Western democracies, it's hard to say that, that there's a lot of downside risk to remaining within the Union. You're not going to face genocide or these other sorts of problems that we see in the rest of the world. I'm going to skip European Union issues for time. Current challenges: Scotland, Catalonia, Basque Country, Flanders, Faroes, and Corsica. I'm just going to very briefly touch on these and say that in all of these cases, there are factors that reduce the appeal of secessionism as well as ones that promote it. And in Scotland and Catalonia, we probably have some of the strongest economic and political rationales for voters to support independence. In Scotland, it's mostly ideological, the fact that Scotland is very far from the British median. In addition, Scotland probably won't suffer tremendously economically from independence because of its oil, which more or less makes up for the fact that the British state employs more Scots than it does elsewhere in the country. In Catalonia, by contrast, it's more the economic rationale than the ideological one. Most independent estimates show that up to about 8% of Catalonia's GDP each year is transferred to the rest of Spain. So that provides a pretty strong, at least in the minds of many voters, a pretty strong rationale for stopping those transfers through independence. In the rest of these cases, we don't see as strong a rationale for independence, and we're less likely to see it occur. In the Basque Country, it's because of the extent of fiscal autonomy that they already enjoy. They don't experience that sort of net fiscal drain that Catalonia does. And furthermore, we see we see a secular decline in support for secessionist parties in the Basque Country over the last 30 years. Thank you.
Yes, sure. Okay, as I promised, that was really more of the overview of the dynamics that can occur in many of these cases. What we're going to do now is zero in on some of the more specific cases. Our next speaker is Camilo Villarino-Marzo, who's a Spanish career diplomat. Since 2008, he has served at the Spanish Embassy in Washington, D.C. as a political counselor. He has also practical experience dealing with secessionist movements elsewhere in the world. He previously has worked in Croatia from 1994 to 1997 as the deputy chief of mission. And he is the author of, here we go, Un Mundo en Cambio, Perspectivas de la Política Exterior de la Unión Europea. Oh, if it was Italian, I would have done much better, I assure you. But that was close. Okay, translated, it's A Changing World, Perspectives of European Union Foreign Policy, which was published in 2009.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Since I am on the record, a little disclaimer, all opinions expressed here are only mine and they do not represent necessarily the position of the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Spanish government. That gives me more ground to say exactly what I think about the situation. Well, although I would love to speak about many of the subjects which have been touched upon today, I will focus my remarks obviously on the question of Catalonia, since I think that will be of greater interest to the audience. I will start with a very short introduction to Spanish history, which I think isn't necessary in order to understand exactly what is going on right now in Spain. Okay, this is Portugal, this is Spain, this is France. Spain, don't be afraid, we'll go to the ancient times, but that will be very quick. Before the Romans arrived, Spain was divided into very different tribes, with Iberians and Celts and the Basque, which were there already. We don't know where they came from, but they have been there for millennia. They speak a language which is not Indo-European. There is maybe a link with the Caucasian languages. Nobody is certain about that. And when the Romans came to what was called by the Greeks Hispania already, the idea of a certain political entity in this geographical peninsula comes to life, including what is today Portugal. The Romanians gave to that territory this idea of unity. They divided it into provinces, but there was this idea of a whole entity. The Visigoths came later on, and they kept basically this idea of a united kingdom. The capital was then in Toledo, very close to Madrid. Then, at the beginning of the 8th century, the Arabs came. They occupied the whole of north of Africa. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. The name Gibraltar comes from the Arab Jebel al-Tariq, the place where Tariq disembarked. And they occupied very quickly, in a few years, all Spain. Basically, they went into France until they were stopped in Poitiers. Well, all the way except for certain small areas here in the north, where small valleys in the mountains. Spain is quite a mountainous country. So the Basques, the Asturians, the Cantabrians, the Aragonese, small groups of Christian Visigoths and indigenous populations kept their, let's say, independence at that moment. This is important because those groups began state by state to move south and to what we call in Spanish history the reconquest the country, step by step. Took 8 centuries. And then these small kingdoms were isolated from each other. So that at that moment the Latin was the vulgar Latin, the popular Latin, was the language used for communication, was kind of lingua franca, and used for educated people. But it began to evolve differently into the different regions. So that today we have here Galicia, where they speak language which is very closely related to Castilian. We can understand each other easily, and is extremely closely linked to Portuguese. In fact, Portugal was at the given moment part of Galicia. It became independent later on. Then we have the Castilian, which was born here, and then we have the Catalan, which appears here. In the 9th and the 10th century, the Franks, which were the German tribes which had occupied France, they built here what they call the Hispanic March. It was a kind of buffer county to stop the Arabs to enter into France. There is two geographical ways to go into from Spain to France. Here, what is today the Basque Country, and here. All the rest is very mountainous. So therefore, in order to stop the Arabs, they built this buffer state, which is the origin somehow of Catalonia. Okay, they have some counts there, the Catalan counts, from the 9th and the 10th century. And the language, which was Latin, began to evolve in a different way that it was evolving here, the origin of the Castilian. But at the same time, 11th century. In the 12th century, the Catalans united with the Aragonese crown, which was here, one of those kingdoms which were being born. Castilla was this area. And they united, so in the 12th century, with Aragon. And since then, there has been a close relation between Catalonia and Aragon. I am Aragonese myself from this. So Catalan as a language was spoken here and also in Valencia and also in the Balearic Islands. In the beginning of the 16th century, the Aragonese crown, all this area, united with Castilla, with the Catholic kings. And since then, that was 500 years ago, we consider that the idea of a modern Spain was reborn. But that gives you an idea why there are different languages being spoken in Spain, why those languages are so closely linked. If I listen carefully, I can understand Catalan more if I read it than orally. Galician is even easier to understand. Portuguese is also quite easy to understand for a Spanish speaking person. And the same way we can understand quite easily Italian. French is different. French is more separated. And in fact, the Catalan is kind of a mixture with Italian and French in the sense of the word and the vocabulary, the constructions, emphasis, etc. Of course, during the centuries, there have been grievances about autonomy here and there. We have had wars, we have had civil wars in Spain. The fact is that in 1978, democracy was reestablished in Spain after Spanish dictatorship under Franco. Franco died in 1975. We began transition to democracy, and a new constitution was approved in December 1978. Part of the constitutional pact was the granted of regional autonomy to those regions we were asking for it. And in fact, the Spanish constitution, without going into the details, recognizes the idea that there are two kinds of regions, and speaks about regions and nationalities. It doesn't define what a nationality is. It doesn't define which regions are nationalities. The understanding being that Galicia, the Basque Country, and Catalonia somehow were different than the others. Fact is that today we have 17 different autonomies in Spain, and Catalonia, Galicia, and the Basque Country are three of them. Spain, in everything but name, is a federal state, with one exception. Our Senate. We have Senate and we have a Congress of Deputies, the lower chamber, but the Senate is not properly a territorial chamber. It is true that the senators are elected by territories, but it doesn't work that way. It's, let's say, the weak point we have when defending that Spain is a federal state. But in all other senses, Spain really works as a federal state. Catalonia has a high degree of autonomy with a Statute of Autonomy which was approved in 1980. I have to say that when the Constitution was approved in Spain by referendum, it got even bigger support in Catalonia than in the rest of Spain. Also, the Statute of Autonomy of Catalonia in 1979 was approved by a big majority of the population, 80%, with the 60% of the electorate participating at the elections. This Statute of Autonomy from 79 has been enforced till 2006. In 2006, a new Statute of Autonomy was approved. The situation was a different one, because the first one was truly very consensual in all senses. In what was approved in Catalonia, it was approved by the Spanish Parliament with enormous support. The Statute of Autonomy of 2006 got much weaker support because it's much more nationalistic. And in fact, it was opposed at the Spanish Parliament by more than 40% of the deputies. And when approved in Catalonia, it was approved with an enormous majority of the parliament. But in the referendum convened in Catalonia, it got only 70% out of less than 0.5% of the electorate taking part of the election. So something like 35% of the electorate Catalan truly, fully supported the new Statute of Autonomy. It was in that sense divisive. What has happened since then is that the Constitutional Court considered in 2010 that some elements of this new Statute of Autonomy were unconstitutional and that some other elements had to be reinterpreted in order to make them compatible with the Spanish Constitution. This was resented very much by some groups among the nationalists in Catalonia. And then with the new government of Convergencia y Unió, with Artur Mas, the question of the fiscal imbalance was raised. This has been a very old discussion. Catalonia is one of the richest regions in Spain for several reasons. One of them, simply geographical position. And that means that when you are collecting taxes, income taxes, you collect more taxes from Catalonia than you do it, for example, from Extremadura, which is here. Territories do not pay taxes. Individuals pay taxes. Companies pay taxes. But you can, of course, make a reference, as the one that Jason made, that, and that has been widely used by the Catalan nationalists, that more than 8% of the Catalan GDP is being transferred to the rest of Spain. It is true that you can make the accounts in many different ways. I am not going to go into the details. We have no time for that, but I can do it later on the questions and answer time if you want. But there are figures which show that, for example, in 2009, which is the date, the last year where the figures can be got, this 8.4% of transfer can be opposed by a transfer from the rest of Spain to Catalonia of 2.1% of the Catalan GDP. Depends truly on how you make the account. The fact is that there is an economic crisis in Spain. We have 26% of unemployment, 50% of unemployment among the young people, and Catalonia is the most indebted region in Spain. So the Convergencia y Unió is facing a very difficult political situation, and suddenly it discovers that raising the question of the fiscal balance is something which gets extraordinary support among the Catalan population. And it raised that. And it asks to have the same fiscal system that the Basques have. The Basques represent only 6% of the Spanish GDP. Catalonia represents 20% of the Spanish GDP. The Basque system works in, I have to say, in an unequal way, because the Basque country is the most developed region in Spain. They have the highest income per person in Spain. And after the system has been applied, their income per person is even bigger. If we apply this system to Catalonia, the whole fiscal system in Spain will collapse. So there is a practical reason why we can do that with Basque Country, why we cannot do that with Catalonia. The Catalans are aware of that, but they are aware also of the difficult situation they are facing, and they thought that a way out of that would be to defend independence. What has happened now is that Convergencia i Unió, which is the main nationalist party, is now getting less votes than another nationalist party from the left, Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya. In fact, Convergencia i Unió was a moderate nationalist party. Esquerra Republicana has always been the strong nationalist party in Catalonia. Now that Convergencia i Unió has launched this movement pro-independence, is starting to lose votes because the electorate is moving towards Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya. Anyway, even now, in this situation, the support that independence gets in Catalonia is slightly more than 50% of the population. More than 40% of the population oppose this. And this is becoming very divisive in Catalonia. There was a huge increase recently in support for independence, and now this support is going down. But the amount of division that this is creating between the population in Catalonia is very important. And a lot of consensus that existed before, for example, about languages. Catalan language is widely used in Catalonia, the same way Spanish is widely used in Catalonia. Most of the Catalans are bilingual in both languages. 46% of the Catalan population uses Spanish as mother tongue. But even this, the Catalan language is the vehicular language for education. So in primary education, secondary education, you have Catalan as the main language for all matters at the school. This is tolerated without great difficulties by the whole of the population, including those who have Spanish as a mother tongue. If they go down this road, asking for more and more autonomy and even independence, we are very much afraid that this consensual state of the current Catalan political arena, including the question of the languages, as I was saying, will be broken down. Thank you.
All right. For those of you who thought that secession in the Balkans is only a retrospective issue, our next speaker will explain to you that it may very well be a prospective issue as well. Matthew Parish also has the distinction of coming the furthest to be here with us today, and therefore also, I believe, the most jet-lagged. That's correct. Okay. Matthew is a British international lawyer based in Geneva, Switzerland, where he is a partner with the law firm Holman, Fenwick, and Willan. But from 2005 to 2007, he worked in Bosnia as the chief legal advisor to the international supervisor of the contested city of Brčko. Brčko, so complicated, even Richard Holbrooke couldn't figure it out. He is the author of several books, including a book entitled A Free City in the Balkans, Reconstructing a Divided Society in Bosnia. Matthew Parish.
I have a map of Bosnia on a flash disk. Is there any hope we can get it up? It's not absolutely essential. Yes. Try that. Voila. Oh. That's about good enough. Well, no, it's not good at all.
It's gone.
Yeah? And will we get the whole lot, including the south, then? I mean, these are just the cantons. Yeah. If not, it doesn't matter. I'll let you know that'll do.
Is that okay?
It's a little faint.
You mean the map, not Bosnia.
Yeah.
That's good enough. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I have a passion about Bosnia, and it's a passion which is bound to be disappointed because I feel that for all the efforts the international community has made in trying to build this state and trying to reconstruct it after a terrible war in which 2.5% of the population, 100,000 people died, for all the efforts, and this was the first big state-building project by the West undertaken by the United States and the European Union jointly at the end of the Cold War, for all the efforts that have been made and the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars that have been spent trying to redesign and reconstruct this country after the war, it has been an unmitigated failure. And I say that with a heavy heart, because this is a country for which I have great passion, and it's also a country which some of you know I have now been connected to through marriage. And I suppose it is a country that will always remain, therefore, in my blood. My wife and daughter are both citizens of this country, and it is a tragedy for me to have to relate to you the circumstances in which it is irreversibly falling apart. Now, every time I talk about Bosnia, I try to update the story a little bit, because it's an enormously complicated one. And it goes back not just to the Dayton Peace Accords, with which you'll be familiar, in December 1995, which created this rather curious political structure you're now looking at on the map of Bosnia. But it also goes back actually quite a lot further, and it goes back to the intervention of the international community in the destruction of the country then known as the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia back in 1990 and 1991, the intervention of a number of Western diplomats in that process and the attempts to try to avert a war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And to understand where we are today, you have to go at least that far back to understand why the war started at all, to understand why a political compromise couldn't be reached between the three principal ethnic groups. And in fact, you have to go back even further. And obviously in 15 minutes, I can't do that. But what I'm going to do is give you a super succinct summary of how we got to where we are today. And even that is a very strange story. Very roughly, it goes like this. The Bosnian Serbs had a significant and overwhelming military advantage in the war because they had access to the Yugoslav National Army's arms dumps. They were overrunning the Muslims, I'm now going to call them the Bosniaks, and the Croats. The Americans forced the Bosniaks and the Croats to cooperate, and they created something called the Washington Agreement, which imagined that at the end of the war, the country would be split into a series of cantons, something along the Swiss model, with significant devolution of power to the cantons, and you would have, a bit like you do in Switzerland, French-speaking cantons, German-speaking cantons. You would have Bosniak cantons and Croat cantons. And then it was anticipated that the Bosnian Serbs would eventually sign up to much the same regime, and you would have Serb cantons. And hence the Washington Agreement created what is now known as the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which had 10 cantons. The problem was, the technique that was used to try to force the Bosnian Serbs to sign up to this regime was to overtly and covertly use military means against the Bosnian Serbs. The US government was directly involved in doing that in the course of late 1994 and in the course of 1995, so that Bosnian Serb territorial acquisitions during the war were rolled back. Then Richard Holbrooke and his team forced everybody around the table at Dayton to hammer out an agreement. The problem was that the Serbs refused to buy into the cantonalization structure because they wanted their own territory, which was not a canton, but had some other sort of status. What they really wanted, and what they'd really been fighting for, was an independent state. The muddy compromise was that there would be two so-called entities, a ludicrous word that means virtually nothing, but it was created and it was used precisely because it didn't mean anything. You would have a country called Bosnia and Herzegovina. One of the entities would be called the Federation with all its cantons, and the other entity would be called Republika Srpska, because to the Serbs they could kind of pretend with a name like that in fact they'd had a state. And then on top of that, you created a region in the north of the country, which was subject to something called international arbitration. Nobody really knew what that was. Actually, it's a sort of international court where you're supposed to have impartial judges who decide upon disputes. That isn't what happened, because the arbitrator certainly wasn't impartial. It was one of Richard Holbrooke's best buddies and a former State Department legal advisor. That individual created a territory, carved it out through judicial ruling, called Birchko District, which was then run as under a pro-consular regime of international supervision, where an American State Department official would run it through diktat. That model was then embraced in the rest of the country in the office of the High Representative, who started off as a mediator, who became a dictator, and who ran the country with an iron fist. Progressive High Representatives became ever more dictatorial in their methods, culminating in my fellow countryman Paddy Ashdown, who had the most centralising agenda and felt that the Bosniaks had been cheated in the war, and as compensation for the fact that they'd been cheated in the war, and I leave to one side whether they were cheated, that's not an issue I can get into today, but this was certainly the perception on the part of the international community and on the part of Paddy Ashdown, was to compensate for the fact that they had been cheated. The Dayton Peace Accords that had created a centrifugal political structure would essentially be rewritten by stealth. And they would be rewritten through creating state institutions that the Dayton Peace Accords had not anticipated, by forcing overt or covert constitutional reform upon the parties, by building up the state at the expense of the entities, and by building up the state also at the expense of the cantons. And because the Bosniaks form at least a plurality, or possibly a bare minority, of the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a centralisation agenda would benefit the Bosniaks and would be to the detriment of the Serbs and to a lesser extent the Croats. The Serbs had got an awful lot of what they wanted out of the Dayton Peace Accords, which was substantial autonomy in their own entity, and the Croats had mostly got what they wanted. They'd got a number of Croat-dominated cantons which were adjacent to Croatia proper, and where they could more or less go about doing their own thing as long as they did it relatively quietly. So the Bosnian Serbs had an entity with its own parallel governing structures, with a president, a prime minister, a cabinet, a constitutional court. Then the Federation had all those institutions, but the Croats ignored all those institutions and instead ran their own affairs using parallel structures, much as the Kosovar Serbs do, north of the Ibar, so I understand. And then the Bosniaks were left with this political structure, which would be built up at the instance of the international community in order that they would, if you like, the political settlement that was reached at the end of the war and embodied in the Dayton Peace Accords would be rewritten in their favour. And that was the international community's agenda between 1997 and roughly 2006. And the problem with this agenda was that roughly 50% of the population of Bosnia and Herzegovina did not want to go along with it. The Serbs and the Croats did not want this because the very reason they were fighting the war and they were all fighting each other was precisely to avoid an independent, centralized Bosnia, the fear of which was it would be Bosniak dominated. Now, you can consider those fears justified, unjustified, paranoid. You can go back to the atrocities and terrible events that occurred in the war, which in fact, very unfortunately, were some terrible events and atrocities committed by all three sides. You can debate endlessly the justice and what was right and what was wrong in the war. But the the bottom line, ladies and gentlemen, is that people fight wars for a reason. They fight wars because the outcome matters. And the outcome of the Bosnian War was this. It was mass expulsion of all three groups from each other's territory. It was division of Bosnia into mono-ethnic political Bantustans, just mono-ethnic blocks in a very unfortunate ethnic map, which was then created, which was then mapped onto a political map in the Dayton Peace Accords. So then you had almost a decade of work to try to centralize and unwind and undo the results of war. And then do you know what happened in 2006? The international community got bored, as they always do, because they had no strategic interest in Bosnia, because it's 4 million people and everybody's poor. Nobody much cared about this place once the international journalists had gone, and the quality of the diplomats went downhill, and the quality of the members of the Office of the High Representative plummeted. All the good people had gone. Nobody decent was left. And it was like taking the lid off the pressure cooker. And the story right now is a sad one. It's one of slow but inevitable decline from a model of forced centralization through the international community to the Serbs and the Croats slowly pulling themselves away and pulling apart all the institutions that the international community had tried to impose through diktat and force. What does the European Union do about this now, with this basket case of a country on its doorstep, possibly the most dysfunctional political system in all Europe, in this crazy system of crazy political map with 3 constitutional courts, 5 presidents, 13 prime ministers? It's a complete disaster. It makes no logic at all. What is the European Union supposed to do? With the Serbs pulling away, the Croats wanting to do their own thing, probably annex themselves onto a Croatia once it's in the European Union. There are voices who will tell you we need to go back to the good old days. I am not one of them. I do not believe that state building by fiat was ever a good idea. I was part of it. I was writing these orders, and then I was imposing them and using the techniques we had, and I was imposing them against people's will and using the techniques of fear and terror and despotism to force people to live together who didn't want to. And ladies and gentlemen, it was a mistake, because you can't stay there doing that forever. You can't act like Tito forever. Sooner or later, you walk away and people are going to end up doing what they always wanted to do in the first place. And the story now is of the presence of the Bosnian Serbs. And the Bosnian Serbs are remarkably politically unified in this, have an explicit agenda for separation from the rest of the country. They're pretty open about it. They say that Bosnia simply can't survive as a single state. The Croats, despite all sorts of consociationalist attempts to protect their interest in the country, the Croats feel disenfranchised. Why? Actually, because they're only about 8% of the population. There used to be a lot more, but they all left because they got Croatian passports, and Croatia's about to join the EU. So the Croats who are left feel disenfranchised, and we're in the invidious position of having a Croat a member of the presidency of Bosnia who was not supported by anywhere near a majority of Croats. In fact, only, he was voted into office through the quirks of Bosnia's political system by Bosnian Muslims. So they feel they have no representation at the presidential level in the country, and the country is disintegrating. You pile onto that the terrible circumstances of endemic poverty in the country, which have become worse and worse since 2008 and the financial crisis, and you feel that people are starving and hungry and their blood is boiling, and the country and these ethnic tensions are a form of release for the tension and pressure that people are under. So I see things getting worse and worse there as people's grinding day-to-day poverty carries on. What should the European Union do? I don't think we can go backwards. My own view, sad as it is that the least bad result is to accept the fragmentation of the country and to try to manage it. In the meantime, to promote whatever resources we can to economic development of Bosnia, rather than trying to get involved in its perennially sticky politics, to try to lift people out of poverty. Because it's poverty which is one of the main drivers of continued ethnic animosity in post-war Bosnia. And if we could solve that, and if we devoted all the resources we did to political state building instead to economic development, we might not have been in the mess we are today. Ladies and gentlemen, I say at the end of my first book that the people of Bosnia deserved better, and we failed them. I think time has proven that to be about right. We clumsily intervened in this country. We left it in a catastrophic mess. We're now on the verge, I feel, of renewed civil confrontation in that country. And we seem to have a dangerous secessionist movement which nobody appears able to stop. The United States has lost interest. The European Union is so embroiled in its own messes that it can't devote any resources whatsoever. And we're left with a basket case on the corner of Europe. It's a catastrophe, and let's at least not learn from this and not do it again. Thank you very much for listening.
The irony is that in the Balkans they consider Matthew an optimist. Okay, our discussant today, to try and synthesize some lessons from these three excellent and dynamic and diverse presentations, is my colleague from across campus from the government department, Rob Moser, who's Associate Professor of Government here at the University of Texas. He specializes in the study of electoral systems, political parties, and post-communist politics, and he recently co-authored a book by published by Cambridge University Press entitled Electoral Systems and Political Context. Rob.
I'm going to actually stand because I'm always more comfortable when I can stand, and I can't promise that I won't pace. So, now, these three presentations, I think, offer what I would suggest is an overriding perspective, at least mine, when it comes to an issue as complex as secessionism. And that is that what this process that involves so many different factors and causes and consequences really present for the policy community, for academics like myself and others here, is a situation where our biggest challenge is how little we really know about the causes and consequences of this dynamic. I study post-communist states. My specialization, regional specialization, is Russia. And one thing that I thought of when trying to prepare for this session was what I was thinking about in the early 1990s when I was just getting out of graduate, well, no, I was still in graduate school. And the Soviet Union was falling apart, and then you had really one of the largest sort of sequences of secessionist movements to occur, in modern history, in the breakup of the Soviet Union and the breakup of other post-communist states. And what I remember from that episode and the thinking there is how many different perspectives there were about the collapse of the Soviet Union and what was going to happen after the Communist Party was, falling apart in front of our eyes, and the Soviet Union was falling apart in front of our eyes. And I remember going to a talk by Paul Goebel, who was predicting that once the Soviet Union falls apart, Russia's going to fall apart and disintegrate into multiple different states and mini states. And his big warning was, where is this ever going to end? That the big threat with the disintegration, or he was much more optimistic, the great opportunity with the disintegration, he loved the idea of 50 states, right, was that there was a dynamic, especially in the ethnic composition plus the economic and political circumstances there, that once this ball started rolling, there was really no stopping. And also what was always involved in this, and I think rightfully so because of experiences like the former Yugoslavia, was this fear, real and oftentimes realized, of the violence that would accompany this process. What's striking, though, about the collapse of the Soviet Union was that it didn't end that way. One thing that we always try to explain is secession. Why do certain groups and why do certain regions try to secede, and then under what conditions do they succeed or not, and et cetera? We never try to explain the lack of secession. Why doesn't it go on and happen more often rather than less often? And my point here, and I'll try to give a little bit more detail on it, is that the big challenge is how little we know about when and where secession will occur, and then how to manage it and what the consequences will be. Right? Because in my reading of the ethnicity literature and the related secession literature, we don't have anything close to a consensus about the institutions that will further or hinder or manage secession, about the factors, whether they be economic, political, emotional, identity-based, that are pushing this. And so when we're called to say, well, what should be the policy to stop secession or prevent secession or manage secession, I'm just at a loss to how any policymaker could say, okay, well, we need to do this when looking at the evidence. Because what's most striking, it seems to me, is this old sort of saying, going back to Tolstoy, that every happy family looks exactly alike. They're happy for the very same reasons. But every unhappy family is unhappy in its own particular way. And so you have Catalonia that seems to be seceding because it's wealthy, but then you have all this evidence that, economic poverty drives secessionist demands. You have within the political science literature on managing ethnic conflict and competition, in which you have a school of thought led by Aaron Leibhardt, right, the consociationalists. What you need to do is decentralize and have federalism and proportional representation to allow as much co-optation as you can and provide as much autonomy to ethnic minorities as possible. And then you have a raft of literature that will say that federalism promotes demands for autonomy and promotes disintegration. And the latest literature, a colleague of mine, Zach Elkins, had in APSR, American Political Science Review with John Sides, is that if you're trying to keep a state together by promoting national identities, meaning trying to get past regional identities to something that overarches across either group-based identities or not, that proportional representation, the heart of Leiphart's consociational model, is precisely the wrong way to go, right? Because it promotes and institutionalizes and particizes, right? Creates the incentives for group-based parties, ethnic parties. And so then you have the other side of the political science literature, led by people like Donald Horowitz, the centripetalists, right? Who say, no, you got to do exactly the opposite, right? What you need are vote pooling electoral systems in which, instead of providing an environment in which elites have incentives to emphasize and politicize group identities, as they say proportional representation does, right? Because it is designed even from the consociational model to allow for ethnic parties for that kind of representation. What you need is the exact opposite. You need an electoral system that promotes multi-ethnic parties, right? Multi-ethnic coalitions, and you have to provide an environment, a political and electoral environment that sort of pushes and forces elites to reach across group boundaries, right? And from this school of thought, you get these suggestions that really what you really need to do is have preferential voting systems. Preferential voting systems are voting systems that either through the alternative vote or the single transferable vote will provide voters with an opportunity to rank their party preferences rather than just vote for one and by implication vote against all the others. And the idea there is that in ranking your political preferences, you will create an environment that promotes, especially in ethnically divided societies, this kind of multi-ethnic coalition building and moderation, right? Because if you design it correctly, according to this school, what you're going to do is you're going to provide an electoral incentive for elites to reach across group boundaries and have to attract votes from other groups in order to win elections. Now, who's right? The problem with all of this is that there's no real evidence, I would say, to say consociationalism works everywhere. Or potentially, if you're trying to be prospective here, anywhere in particular. The same goes for centripetalist approaches. Aaron Leiphart, in all of his critiques of centripetalism, is, this is too complex of a system for many countries. It's risky, and there's no evidence that it ever works. And so why would any country like Iraq try to be able to get their minority populations who are very much, vulnerable and frightened and like of majority rules to agree to a system that would allow them to be part of potentially a multi-ethnic coalition rather than have their own ethnic party? No minority group that is that vulnerable in those sorts of ethnically divided contexts would ever be attracted to that kind of thing. It doesn't provide enough security. And so what I would say is that I would agree with Jason. I take a rationalist view of secession. The problem is that when it comes to concrete conclusions, that rationalist view gets us very little in terms of predictive, prospective sorts of policy programs, or even a good sense of when you can expect and under what conditions you can expect secession to happen here but not here. Or that when secession does start, or secessionist movements do start to emerge, that this prospect or this process of secession is going to be the terrible kind of secession with the ethnic cleansing and the violence, or the more manageable kind of secession, like the separation of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So if a policy, when you're thinking about current dilemmas, okay, what should the EU do about any of these particular cases? It strikes me that a real dilemma is that the empirical evidence and the theories out there provide us too little guidance for putting together a general kind of understanding of what's driving these processes that you can apply to multiple countries in multiple contexts. Or even a conditional kind of theory that says, under these conditions, with these economic, social, ethnic, and political conditions, you should have this kind of electoral system and this mode of international involvement and this type of constitution. We're not even to a point where we can have multiple theories, it seems to me. And that would be my take on these cases. So, thanks.
All right, we're going to take about 15 minutes of questions and answers from the panel. If people could, if they have questions, just get up and step over to the microphone stand over there. I'm sure the panelists would love to respond directly to some of what Rob said. What I would encourage you to do is simply to try and incorporate any responses you have to Rob into your responses to some of the questions from the audience. Sandy Levinson from the UT School of Law.
I thought this was a terrific panel. Just the whole day has been very illuminating. I have two quite different questions from a legal or quasi-legal context. One is, do you think it matters in the least what a constitution says? You mentioned that the French Constitution says, don't even think about it. The Soviet Constitution, although nobody ever expected that it would be taken seriously, in Article 72, very explicitly recognized the possibility of secession. The European Union recognizes the possibility of secession. The United States Constitution is absolutely silent, doesn't tell you one thing or the other about it, but doesn't matter. A second legally related question deals with the part of the U.S. Constitution I find very interesting, which is the Second Amendment, because it does seem to me that secessionist movements would be more likely to the extent that subnational entities are legally entitled or, as a matter of fact, have their own militias. So with regard to advising groups in a pluralistic country, I mean, one of the questions presumably you might offer advice on is electoral systems. And Rob presented, I thought, an excellent overview of why one may or may not prefer a particular electoral system. But would any of you ever, unless you were advising the central government, would you ever advise a group you were advising to give up their arms? at least in the short run.
Camilo?
Okay. Well, I will address two issues in particular. The one is whether constitution matters. Well, I guess it depends on quite a few things, but at least it depends, in my opinion, on one in particular, whether this was a question that was discussed when the Constitution was drafted, whether this is a question which was the object of a consensus. And in the case of Spain, this was discussed. The question of recognizing the possibility of a right of succession was discussed, was rejected, and the outcome was a consensus which granted a high degree of autonomy to the regions, which granted in particular to the Navarre and the Basque Country this particular fiscal system they have. And as I said before, in the case of Catalonia, the outcome was that the Constitution was even more supported than in the rest of Spain. So I think in this case, one could say, yes, it matters, because we discussed that and we reached an agreement. That's why, for example, now, if you make a poll in Spain, most Spaniards could be ready to accept an independent Catalonia, provided first the Constitution is amended, which requires, of course, the participation of the whole of the Spaniards. That's the idea. We reach an agreement. If we want to change it, we are ready to discuss it, but we all together will discuss it. That's the problem when you defend that thesis about the right of decide for a particular part, whether Quebec has a right to decide, whether Catalonia has a right to decide, independently from the rest of the country. And then the question of the electoral system, I agree that is a very important one. In fact, when the Spanish Constitution was drafted, just 1 year before we had adopted a new electoral system, Franco died in 1975, we had the elections on a reform of the legal system in 1976, and in 1977 we had a new electoral law, and in 1978 the Constitution. This law from 1977 hasn't been modified, minor amendments. And the substance of it is a proportional system, applying the don't system, but on the basis of the provinces. That gives an enormous weight to the regional and nationalist parties. They are much more represented in the national parliament than the national parties which are not the majority parties. In order to get a vote, in order to get a deputy, if you are presented yourself in the whole of Spain, you need much more votes than if you are just getting a vote, for example, in the province of Barcelona and Catalonia. You want just a deputy there. And the understanding was that this was part of the constitutional package. Therefore, when the idea has been discussed, which is the case, about reforming this electoral system, immediately the different nationalist parties have said, no way, we agreed to the Constitution with the understanding that the electoral system was the one we had approved 1 year before.
I'll make a really a point about whether constitutions matter, because I'm quite interested in this subject, really. I think the answer depends almost entirely upon the nature of judicial politics of the country in question, because judicial politics can be so fundamentally different. Of the country of which I'm a national, the United Kingdom, the tradition is that the judiciary do not have a role to play in determining constitutional issues of this nature. That's, I don't know whether that's a cause or effect of the fact that we have no, quote, written constitution or single constitutional documents, but judges stay well away from issues of the separation and balance of powers of that kind. They don't want to know. They consider that there's different sorts of processes should determine that issue, so it doesn't matter. By contrast, in the country of which I'm a permanent residence, Switzerland, the federal tribunal considers itself amply qualified to determine disputes between the cantons and between the cantons and the federal governments. Recently striking down, for example, laws banning smoking by individual cantons because they said it was a matter that had to be decided on a federal level. Now, it's a sort of rather curious example, but it just gives you it just shows you why that in Switzerland it is part of the politics of the judiciary that they will get involved in balance of power issues and hence, I suppose, secession issues. If the canton of Jura ever really decided it wanted to leave Switzerland and join France, they'd be mad, but occasionally they talk about it. And then you look at a country like Bosnia, where the judicial politics is premised almost entirely upon pure corruption, just people lining their pockets as much as they possibly can. And the Constitutional Court, notwithstanding its various international members, has proven itself wholly inept at delineating the proper separation of powers between Bosnia's various federal and sub-federal units, because the role of the courts in many communist countries was simply as instruments of the political executive. That was the role of the courts in socialism, and that tradition of obedience to politics to politicians has been followed, and therefore the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina has proven to be a failure, whereas the Dayton Peace Accords anticipated it having a much more central role in determining these sorts of disputes. So it's totally dependent on how judges fit into your political system, I think.
Jason?
Those are really interesting and provocative questions. Briefly on do constitutions matter in the least? I would say yes, they matter in the least. They matter as coordination points, I think, for political leadership and political culture. They reflect the existing political culture and the attitudes of political leadership. But they can be changed. They can be amended. Political leadership can move away from the existing text. Constitutions can be amended. In Spain, for instance, it's highly unlikely that the Spanish military will invade Catalonia to put down an independence attempt. Right? This is going to be a battle that's going to be fought politically, but there are no rules to determine how that battle will be fought. And I would argue that it's at least good to have some ground rules. Britain and Canada don't have constitutional rights to secede, but the political leadership has treated it as a negotiable issue, and we're going to come to some terms about the precise conditions under which this will be permitted. Would I ever advise a secessionist group to give up its arms? You're creating a commitment problem, right, for the central government. We're going to give up our arms. Now what are you going to do to us, right? And so I would only advise them to do that if there were some robust and credible commitment, which would probably, and I guess the point is that these institutional parchment barriers are not usually enough. And maybe that's some third-party guarantor or something like that that allows that to happen. I fully agree with the gist of Rob's commentary here that there really are no universal solutions. There are no silver bullets. We can't say that we can apply this ready-made solution and stamp it everywhere. I'm reminded of James C. Scott's critique of high modernism, this idea that there are these universal rules of human behavior and we can just go around blithely and tweak human behavior easily knowing these scientific principles. It's highly contextual. You have to look at the facts on the ground, and I'm much more of a fan of, for instance, in the case of Bosnia, a bottom-up form of institution building rather than a top-down form of institution building in which we start with the status quo, the centralized state, and then figure out how to carve that up in such a way as it is agreeable to the parties. Instead, why don't we look at techniques such as rolling cantonization, which we start at the most local possible level to set boundaries by some sort of referendum process, town by town. Which district do you want to be part of? Build it up from the bottom. Again, it's not a universal silver bullet, and it's a clunky and difficult way of doing things, but in some deeply divided societies, that may be the first step you try to hold it together.
Well, as we heard in Spain, that only took about 1,500 years. So.
Yeah.
Right. We have at least two questions, so why don't we take both of them now, please?
So Lawrence Vade again, I'm an adjunct professor here at the LBJ School. So I wanted to just bring the EU back into this conversation just because that's what I'm most interested in. So especially, Jason, you talked about this kind of typology of different things that lead to either more or less pressures for secessionism. And I wonder, how does EU membership or EU candidate status come into this? Because I can imagine an argument that, because the EU has subsidiarity and basically takes away a lot of power from national governments and then also, in a backward way, gives them back to regional governments, that would make secessionism less likely because you can actually gain autonomy in alternative ways, right? You can gain control over certain policy areas in that way. So that I can see that reducing pressures for secessionism. On the other hand, I can imagine an argument that, the EU is seen as this, this zone of peace, and as you noted, it's unlikely that it's going to come to an armed conflict between Spain and Catalonia, right? So in that sense, the risk for making kind of autonomy demands is much lower, right? Because it's unlikely that you're just going to be, put down. So I can imagine arguments either way, right? So I'm just kind of curious, how do you see it? Does EU membership or EU candidacy status, and are those two the same or different, lower or raise the chances of secessionist movements?
Edward Joseph?
Thank you, Alan. Just first, I wanted to say, Camilo, hats off. That was absolutely the most brilliant, lucid explanation of a complex historical subject I've ever seen explained in such a short period. Really remarkable. And then I wanted to comment on Matthew's argument, and do so carefully, because Alan has told me that I'm allowed only one Balkan dust-up during this session, and I've already used that.
It was actually one per panel.
That's exactly right. I got one before that. But no, let me try to stick to the original ration of only one, and therefore focus on where we agree as a way of opening, and which is, Matthew, I think you're absolutely right that Bosnia is in terrible shape, and it is serious and deserves attention. I couldn't agree with you more. And I also agree with you that you put your finger on which many people do not, on the real root cause of the whole problem, which was the imbalance in weaponry that the Serbs had enjoyed, having essentially appropriated the Yugoslav National Army. And it was the use of those weapons, of course, I think you would agree as well, that the Serbs used to commit the demonic acts for which they've been demonized. And where I would just add a nuance here, a slight difference, is that while you say all three sides committed atrocities, there is no Croat version of Vukovar, which is a town in Croatia you didn't mention, but just very close to Brčko, where you and I both worked, which was absolutely leveled by the Serbs, by Serb heavy artillery. And there is no, of course, Muslim Srebrenica, where 7,000 men and boys perished at the hands of the Serbs. They simply don't exist, and therefore it's really not helpful in any way or accurate to talk about how all three sides committed atrocities. It would be like saying University of Texas and Austin Community College both play football. We're talking about two very different things. Actually, it's the analogy I think may actually work in terms of the comparison of the numbers. But the real question then is, where do you go from that? What is the significance of that? The point is that in terms of how we deal with it is that those facts, and they are facts, leave not a minority, but a possible majority with a grievance. That's the problem we have, Matthew, is that the near majority, which is a Muslim population, has a very deep grievance about what happened. And there's a peace agreement which has been, as you also correctly said, inadequately implemented in many respects. And that should be our focus, is what do we do with that? If we simply say, well, gee, let them live with their grievance, I'm not so sure that's a great idea to have a deeply aggrieved Muslim population in Europe. And briefly, what Ashdown tried to do, in my view, I have a very different view, wasn't to create a centralized Bosnia. I think that's a real distortion. What he was trying to do was rectify the fact, and which you correctly stated, of something that wasn't working. It simply wasn't working, and the Serbs had too many opportunities to obstruct the workings of the central institutions, and there are central institutions in Bosnia. And what Ashdown tried to do, not by imposition generally, that's also a distortion, but generally through agreement, was to try to come to minimally functional central government that would permit Bosnia to enter the European Union, which was the attempt. And so at this point, you're right as well that protectorate and going back is not the solution, but I would suggest to you, Matthew, neither is partition. And any suggestion to that would be, I think, a mistake. And we have to look for something in between those two. And that's not very easy to do.
If I could just implore you to focus your response on the end of the question, and so rather than trying to refight the Balkan Wars and the post-Dayton period and each of the OHRs, really focus prospectively. And I think where Ed ended up there was that because of grievances about past wrongs, therefore the secession of Republika Srpska, the secession of the Croat cantons from Bosnia is not the way to go. I would really ask if you could focus on that part rather than the other, the history.
Does that mean I'm going ahead first?
Why don't you start? Why don't you start?
Okay. I'm not going. We'll just have to agree to differ about what's happened during the Balkan Wars, because I'm not going to go into that right now in the Bosnian War and comparative atrocities. But let's accept your premise that the Serbs were disproportionately responsible for atrocities in the country. Does it therefore follow that it is wise for the international community to force upon the Serbs a model of government which they do not want to have, which was very much part of the reasons why the war started in the first place, and which, absent continuing international community commitments, it is actually impossible to force them to swallow. The problem with OHR's iron fist was that it couldn't stay there forever. And you couldn't force the Serbs to live in a central power-sharing government with the Bosniaks and the Croats without using the various types of force that were at OHR's disposal. And the recent history of Bosnia has been of reversal following lack of interest. And really it doesn't much matter who was at fault more during the last war, or the war before, or the war before that, or all the many other Balkan wars which were fought on Bosnian territory. Was it really matters as a matter of, for a policymaker, is to ask, what can we do, given this political geography, which is sustainable in the long term? What we were trying to do was not sustainable, no matter how legitimate the Bosniaks' grievances may or may not have been. What we did was we made Bosnia's fall far harder than it should have been. And actually, I suggest we made secession in many ways more likely, because we built something up that was unsustainable and that could be so much more easily torn apart. I'm not in favour of heavy-handed intervention. I think that's the big lesson of Bosnia. You have to work with what you've got, not with where you would like the country to be. And however unsatisfactory that political map was, that was where we were at the end of the war. Unless we were going to stay there forever, we weren't going to be able to rewrite it. And that's the rather glum truth. What we would like to do as policymakers does not always correspond with the world's finest ideals. We are constrained by the outcomes of military operations and the political balance of power within a country, however much we might dislike them or find them distasteful.
Okay. I would ask the other panelists to address Lawrence's question, which is, does being in the EU make secession demands or autonomy demands less likely or more likely? And does being a potential EU candidate state make secession or autonomy demands within that state more or less likely? I think that was the gist of the question. So if we could try and do that fairly quickly, so because we're about 10 minutes over at this point.
I will try to give first answer to that. Taking into account the experience in Spain and the one I personally have in my professional life, since I was for several years in charge at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of relations between the European Union and the regional autonomies. I think it works both ways. On the one hand, it is true that because of the enormous transfer of sovereignty from the member states to the central institutions, the member states somehow they are weakened, and the regions perceive that, and they perceive that this idea of a European of regions, which, for example, many federalists defend, could give them more power in Europe. On the other hand, all those countries, such as Spain, where there is a regional structure of government, and where the constitution and the different statutes of autonomy establish who is competent to do what, face a problem when we address European Union issues, because the fact is that the European Union only negotiates with member states, with central authorities. I mean, when the Council of Ministers is reunited, the ministers are represented at the central government. Even if, for example, just to give you an example, we are discussing fisheries, and it is a Scottish minister who is sitting there, he's representing the United Kingdom, he's not representing Scotland. Well, that means that, for example, again, in the case of Spain, certain competencies which have been transferred from the central state to the regions are somehow re-centralized when discussing with the European Union and negotiating with the European Union. That forces us to find quite a complex mechanism which allows us to discuss first internally how to present the Spanish position externally. This is not always well done, and sometimes the regions resent this and complain about this, and different countries have tried to solve this problem differently.
The most plausible argument, I think, that the EU promotes secessionism indirectly is the economic argument. Alex Salmond, the Prime Minister of Scotland, Scottish nationalist, had a quote, it went something like, people ask, what's a wee country like Scotland going to do for food and drug testing? Will it have its own currency? All those questions are answered by the European Union. And so the idea is, well, the EU will handle things that we can't do, we'll have access to this broad trade area, and it reduces the risks of independence. And there's some people who argue that this is the case. Seth Jolly at Syracuse University has a book manuscript about this, arguing that the EU effectively promotes secessionism. But others disagree. Don Brancotti has a paper arguing the exact opposite. So, back to lack of consensus here. And the fact is, EU membership is not automatic, apparently, for Scotland and Catalonia. They'll have to apply for candidate status, and they can expect to accede pretty quickly, but still there's an interim period there. And even after that, the EU right now is not looking like a tremendous buffer for small states. Ireland used to be an example for the Scottish nationalists to point to, not so much anymore. So my view is that if there is an effect, it's a small one.
Yeah, I don't think I had very much to add. I would agree with Jason on that. That it's hard to see exactly how it would work. I would say that it's quite conditional. Besides being small, it depends on specific contexts and conditions, and it might be different across different potential states. And the one thing I would note about my comments that it seems as though I am quite the institutionalist, meaning I think institutions matter a lot. The problem is we just don't know their effects very well. But it's not the case that constitutions don't matter just because we don't know and have a formula so that they matter like this every time. They matter greatly, and that even makes it worse because it's not as if when you're going to hold elections, you get to not decide what kind of electoral system you're going to adopt. You have to adopt something, and it's going to have effects. The problem is that we don't know enough about the effects it might have, and so we need to learn more because we can't avoid these decisions. They're going to be made.
That's great. Okay, folks, we are going to have a 15-minute coffee and snack break out there. We will reconvene at 4 o'clock for the final panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists.